Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Thursday night Anamkara meditation program. And with all my heart and with all my love, I welcome you to our program this evening. So glad you were able to join us. And, this satsang, this keeping the company of the truth that this program is, well, you're the truth. You're the embodiment of that. You're the divine. And this is the practice of being able to know that, see that, feel that, experience that moment by moment is what sadhana, spiritual practice, is all about, and what Anamkara Meditation Foundation is dedicated to making those practices, those meditative practices, freely available to everyone. So thank you for coming and joining us this evening and bringing your divine self. So tonight is a night when we do some readings and contemplations. First, we'll be starting with the opening mantras. And the opening mantras are the sound form of the infant. They're the vibration, a throb of consciousness. Yes, we hear them as sound, and the words have meanings, but the real power of mantra is what we were talking about last week from the Shiva Sutras, Chaitanya consciousness, that pure power of consciousness to take on all forms, and especially this throb, this vibration that is mantra. And in the form of mantra, it serves as a vehicle for helping the mind get free of being so tied to all the things that we engage in and identify with through the day. So we start with the opening mantras. And the opening mantras start with a particular mantra, Shri Mata Kali Mahadevi Ki Jai. So Mata Kali is the divine mother, the great mother. And she is really seen also as the source of all mantra, that she is the one who gives birth to the whole universe within herself, as herself, and takes this unique form of empowered mantra to help consciousness get free of being so involved with identification and caught in these different thought forms, belief forms, physical forms, all the forms. The mind is a form and loves form. So in order to sort of invite it to get free and return to its original nature as unbounded consciousness, we make use of mantra. And the root of mantra is this Shakti, this power of consciousness. So we'll start with the opening mantras. Shri Mata Kali Devi Ki Jai Gajananam Bhuta Ganari Sevitam Kabita Jambu Palacharu Bhakshanam Umasutam Shokam Vinashakarakam Namami Vigneshwara Parapankajam Shri Ganeshayan Namaha Shri Ganeshayan Namaha Shri Ganeshayan Namaha Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamandaya Purnameva Vashishyate Om Shanti 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 Shri Mata Kali Mahadevi Ki Jai. So once again, with all my heart, with all my love, I welcome you to our program this evening. That stillness, that silence, that is the gift of mantra, helps us to be aware of the light of consciousness, the light of universal, unbounded consciousness that illumines everything, all times, all places. Well, when the mind becomes quieter, it's easier for us to shift our attention away from all the content of mind, to come and see the source of it all. That light of consciousness becomes all the forms, delights in that. But the mind as a form gets caught and bound in that. And our identification with the mind and its content means that then we suffer the experience that comes with being so identified with those things. And all the sadhana practices, all spiritual practices, are really aimed at helping us get free of that bondage, that identification. That's also known as ignorance, the root ignorance of vidya. That's taking the false self to be ourself and the infinite as not self, as not who we are. So we want to shift that and be able to see that the infinite is what our nature is, and ultimately also all the limited forms, includes everything. But first we often go through a phase of negating, of stepping back, going neti neti, not this, I'm not that, I'm not the mind, I'm not the body, I'm not the feelings. As with Buddha's Heart Sutra, looking at the content of that sky of awareness as 5 skandhas, these 5 heaps, these 5 aggregates of experience, and saying, no, that's not what I am. I'm Buddha mind. I'm the broad, wakeful consciousness, always present. So that's what we're aimed at. And what I wanted to talk about this evening, as part of the readings, have to do with those kinds of practices and shifting our understanding. But it's also related to actually a question that one of our Sangha members asked last week at the end of the program when we were just chatting. He was talking about shadow. And how do we work with shadow? And we've done a couple of videos in the past that were talking about shadow. And shadow is a term for looking at sort of the hidden parts of ourself, the disowned, unconscious, what's going on that is driving our impulses and driving our behaviors. And shedding light on that is part of what this process is involved with. So Carl Jung was talking about how enlightenment isn't about visualizing light, it's about bringing the light of awareness, the light of consciousness, into the darkness of the unconscious and illuminating it and setting the energy bound there free. So when we're talking about that and how that was approached and is approached in the yogic tradition, it's interesting because the yogic tradition, it wasn't a psychological perspective. It's not like we're so imbued with psychology in our culture now. We think in psychological terms all the time. But when yoga was evolving and being looked at, it was a different kind of psychology that was really being pursued and understood. And so the idea of shadow wasn't what we would be talking about these days. It was just talking about what's the ignorance and how do we transform what drives the mind. And part of that becomes very evident, in terms of the yogic tradition. There's a foundational text that comes out of the Advaita Vedanta tradition, the nondual Vedanta tradition. And the Vedanta Society and Ramakrishna Paramahamsa were great teachers of that. Shankaracharya, the great Advaita Vedantan sage, really could have organized the teachings and has passed those on to the last 1,000 or more years. And so this is a section from Shankaracharya's Viveka-chudamini. Viveka-chudamini means the crest jewel of discrimination. So viveka, discrimination, is a critical faculty of mind, of awareness, that one develops. And when we think of discrimination in yogic terms, it means the ability to differentiate between the true and the untrue, the eternal and the ephemeral. Right? So it's talking about we lack discrimination. In other words, when we get caught and identified with the mind and its impulses, feelings, all that stuff, and we're not discerning that our true nature is the infinite, that has the boundless quality of equanimity, of joy, of unbreakable, rapturous joy, of wisdom, of compassion, that these boundless qualities are our true nature. And instead, we lose our discrimination and get identified with the limited mind. So back then, when Shankaracharya was talking about, well, what are the qualifications for somebody to engage in yoga, to engage in this kind of path? Because clearly they were not saying this is not for everybody. And as you hear this, you'll say, when he talks about the qualities of a disciple, in other words, a follower, a student, and also right in that very term, yoga was always in a relationship between a teacher and a student, the guru and the disciple. That was seen as an absolute essential component, in part to be able to work on those unconscious aspects. And if we're on our own, we don't have a reflecting, illuminating source to help us get free of our own mind and our own blind spots. So when Shankaracharya is talking about the nature of the student or the disciple, that they should be intelligent and learned, with great powers of comprehension, and able to overcome doubts by the exercise of their reason. One who has these qualifications is fitted for knowledge of the self. Now you'll have to excuse the pronouns, for the most part, are masculine. And back in those times, it was really thought of as men could do yoga, and women, they didn't consider that they should be able to do that. So that's a bias that stands out, especially these days. And really, truly, back then, there were great yoginis and great women saints and realized beings. But the language was always in the masculine, unfortunately. So Shankaracharya, writing in that kind of historical context, goes on, he alone may be considered qualified to seek the absolute, who has discrimination, that quality viveka, whose mind is turned away from all enjoyments, who possesses tranquility and the kindred virtues, who feels a longing for liberation. In this connection, the sages have spoken of 4 qualifications for attainment. When these are present, devotion to the reality, to the absolute, will become complete. When they are absent, it will fail. First is mentioned discrimination, viveka, between the eternal and the non-eternal. Next comes renunciation of the enjoyment of the fruits of action, here and hereafter. Then come the 6 treasures of virtue, beginning with tranquility, and last, certainly, is the longing for liberation. So Brahman, the absolute, is real. The universe is unreal. A firm conviction of this is so-called discrimination between the eternal and the non-eternal. Renunciation is giving up of all pleasures of the eyes, ears, and other senses, the giving up of all objects of transitory enjoyment, the giving up of the desire for a physical body, as well as for the highest kind of spirit body of a god. To detach the mind from all objective things by continually seeing their imperfection, and to direct it steadfastly to the absolute, the Godhead, its goal. This is called tranquility. To detach both kinds of sense organs, those of perception and those of action, from objective things, and to withdraw them to rest in their respective centers. This is called self-control. True mental poise consists in not letting the mind react to external stimuli. To endure all kinds of afflictions without rebellion, without complaint, without lament. This is called forbearance. A firm conviction based upon intellectual understanding that the teachings of the scriptures and of one's master are true. This is called by sages the faith that leads to the realization of the absolute. Now, to concentrate the intellect repeatedly upon the pure absolute Brahman and to keep it fixed there always, this is called self-surrender. This does not mean soothing the mind like a baby with idle thoughts. Longing for liberation is the will to be free from the fetters forged by ignorance, beginning with the ego sense and so on, down to the physical body itself, through the realization of one's true nature. So even though this longing for liberation may be present in a slight or moderate degree, it will grow intense through the grace of a teacher and through the practice of renunciation and of the virtues such as tranquility, etc. Then it will bear fruit. So when renunciation and the longing for liberation are present to an intense degree within a person, then the practice of tranquility and the other virtues will bear fruit and lead to the goal. The goal is freedom, enlightenment. Where renunciation and longing for liberation are weak, tranquility and other virtues are a mere appearance, like a mirage in a desert. So among all means of liberation, devotion is supreme. To seek earnestly to know one's real nature, the Atman, the self of all, that is said to be devotion. In other words, devotion can be defined as the search for the reality of one's own highest self. The seeker after the reality of the self, who possesses the above-mentioned qualifications, should approach an illumined teacher from whom they can learn the way to liberation from all bondage. So the ancient sages, when you read the qualifications that they would talk about of what a student or disciple would be, well, they already sound like a saint to most people. They already sound like, well, you must be realized in order to be that free, to be that renounced, to have that kind of unshakable tranquility, to be non-reactive to external stimuli, to be able to have the forbearance to endure whatever conditions life has. These are already attainments for most people, much less that they're qualities that you have to bring to the seeking. But that was what was understood, that in part that's how serious this task was. Because there was also the understanding that these practices, they weren't going to go like this and you were going to be enlightened. These were going to take a long time of practice. And in fact, the Yoga Sutras, we'll look at those in a few moments, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. They start out saying that a yogi should be prepared to practice for lifetimes. So they make it clear right from the beginning. This is going to be a sustained effort. And it's going to take that kind of dedication, which is also why that cultivation for the longing for liberation was seen as a motive force, that one wants to be so free that's the one desire that one is allowed to really cultivate, the desire to be free. That longing for liberation provides a motive force. And we see that even in Buddha, in the Buddhist tradition. Buddha practiced yoga. So he had such a profound longing for liberation, and not just for himself. You know, some yogis in ancient times, they wanted to get free, and it was kind of, well, I got free, and then they took Mahasamadhi, they died, and it was like, swaha, good luck with everybody else. The Buddhist tradition really evolved in Mahayana Buddhism as, no, you're not really free until all beings are free. And so the bodhisattva vows include that we keep practicing and even keep coming back on some level to help all beings become free of suffering. So we can see in this kind of ancient writings the qualifications and how there, in those qualifications, is the way to confront shadow, the unconscious. Because when we don't get what we want, what comes up? Well, our unconscious desires, our conscious desires, our reactivity. So the yogi is dedicated to, first of all, paring down what wants and needs are, that they're very minimal. And if the mind or body is reacting in some way, you're detached. You're just watching that impulse, that reactivity pass through, and watching it from a state of equanimity, a state of peace and calm. Because all the while, you know, your longing is to rest in the divine, is to rest in God, to know God as your own self and the self of all. That's the only place where true delight, true joy, true rapture, true meaning, unqualified, unalloyed, eternal, not just an ephemeral passing thing, I got something delicious, it tasted good, and an hour later you're hungry again. Not that kind of joy, not that kind of pleasure. They're talking about going to the very source. That's the infinite. That's the divine. That's what one is seeking. Now Shankaracharya goes on, and it was also talking about the teacher. He said the teacher is one who is deeply versed in the scriptures, who is pure, free from desire, a perfect knower of the absolute Brahman. He is upheld continually in the absolute, calm, like the flame when its fuel has been consumed, an ocean of love that knows no ulterior motive. So selflessness is a key quality for being to serve the Dharma as a teacher. A friend to all good people who humbly entrust themselves to him. Let the seeker approach the master with reverent devotion. Then, when the teacher is pleased by the student, his humility, love, and service, let him ask whatever may be known about the self, about the Atman. And then he starts to write from that sort of devoted place. He says, O Master, friend of all devotees, I bow down before you. O boundless compassion, I have fallen into the sea of the world. Save me with those steadfast eyes which shed grace like nectar never ending. I am burning in the blaze of the world forest which no man can extinguish. Evil deeds out of the past drive me like huge winds hither and thither. I am full of fear. I have taken refuge in you. Save me from death. I know no other shelter. There are pure souls who have attained peace and greatness. They bring good to mankind, like the coming of spring. They themselves have crossed the dreadful ocean of this world, and without any selfish desire, they help others to cross. It is the very nature of these great souls to work of their own accord to cure the troubles of others, just as the moon of its own accord cools the earth when it's scorched by the fierce rays of the sun. The vessel of your lips has been dipped and filled with the sweetness of the bliss of the Absolute. Pour words from it like drops of nectar upon me. They are purifying, soothing, and delightful to the ear. O Master, I am consumed by the scorching heat of this worldly life, as by the flames of a forest fire. So blessed are they on whom your eyes rests, even for a moment. It is thus that you accept them and make them your own. How shall I cross the ocean of the world? What should be my goal? What way should I take? I know of none. Be gracious, Master, and save me. Tell me how to end the miseries of this earthly life. Withhold nothing. See, scorched by the fierce flames of the world forest, the disciple speaks these words. The great soul looks at the disciple, who thus seeks refuge in him, and his eyes are wet with tears of mercy. Immediately, he frees the disciple from his fear. The disciple who has sought his protection is one who thirsts for liberation, who has properly fulfilled his duties, whose heart has become tranquil, and who has attained calmness of mind. The wise and holy man, out of compassion, begins to instruct him in the truth. So the master then says, O prudent one, do not fear. For you, there is no danger. There is a way across the ocean of worldly life. I shall reveal to you that very method by which sages have reached the other shore. There is a certain potent method of putting an end to the horror of this worldly life, and by it you may cross the world ocean and reach the highest bliss. Meditation on the meaning of the truth as it is taught in Vedanta leads to the highest illumination. By this means, the misery of the worldly life is altogether destroyed. And so then Shankaracharya goes on to teach more about the non-dual philosophy and practices of Advaita Vedanta. Much of which has to do with really cultivating and deepening that power of discrimination. Because discrimination, remember discrimination, viveka, the ability to differentiate between the ephemeral and the eternal, the non-self and the infinite boundless one. That discrimination, moment by moment, in part is also what illuminates shadow. Because in that broader sense, shadow is what's the limitation I've become identified with in the moment. That's the question of who am I? Who am I now? 2 minutes go by. Who am I now? What have I become now? Because moment by moment, we keep becoming something. We become the body, the feelings, the sensations. We become the emotions about something that happened in the past or might happen in the future. We're constantly becoming the content of mind and confusing that content as our own self rather than our boundless nature, really beyond any concept of self. Pure awareness, as Buddha would say it is. Right? So that cultivation of discrimination is part of the practice that also then helps to illuminate what's going on in our unconscious that we need to get free of. Both free of the pattern and change the pattern so it's not driving us, but also free in an absolute sense that we're not identified with any pattern. So we both are doing practices that cultivate good patterns, but even the good patterns are just limitations. So we want to be able to step back from that. So even virtues, yes, we cultivate virtues, but free of identification. You see, virtues are ways for the mind and body, the vehicles of consciousness that we have as mind and body, how they can act in the world for the benefit of all in ways that doesn't create bad karma that we're going to suffer. Remember, he was saying the winds of the horrible, destructive karmas of the past that keep driving us. Well, if we're cultivating positive qualities, we're cultivating then also positive karmas that will support us getting free as life unfolds. So you can see how, again, these are ways of illuminating what these limitations are, that these days we might refer to as shadow, but they were just seen as, no, these are the vagaries of the mind. These are the bound patterns of the mind caught in ignorance, uninformed by the light of its source, the infinite one. Now, even when the mind becomes illuminated by that, your highest nature, it's still limited. The mind, by its nature, is a limited form. But we can come to know that our awareness itself, our consciousness itself, is what enters the domain of total freedom, radical freedom, the freedom that sees all as itself, unimpeded, unhindered by form, that it is taken for the sheer delight of creation and creating all forms in the universe, all beings, everything. without being bound by any of it. That's what the practices are aiming at bringing us to. And it starts out, now when we look at kind of a more ancient text, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, goes back anywhere from several hundred to 1,000 years before Shankaracharya was writing in Viveka-chudamini. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras was first writing down of a set of oral teachings that had been passed on for probably centuries or even millennia before that. And the Yoga Sutras becomes a very kind of specific framework for understanding what practices are. But it too, when it's talking about the qualities of somebody who's going to even begin the practice of yoga and meditation, starts out that saying austerity, study, and the dedication of the fruits of one's work to God. These are the preliminary steps of yoga. So austerity means that kind of renunciation, that you're simplifying your life and not indulging the mind in all its activity and wanting this and not wanting that. So austerity is a way of paring that down, living very simply and confronting that compulsive habit of the mind to want to possess something, to feel bigger, feel more full, when its emptiness and its smallness is due to ignorance, not lack of consuming things. Until one gets that, you could consume the world and still be empty. And that's what we see happening now. People's ignorance driving that kind of blind consumption and hoarding and gathering of wealth. And still, their heart is empty. So yoga was getting that, no, when you know the fullness of your infinite nature, then what do you need other than the little it takes to sustain a body, the little it takes to give you the energy to serve the divine in all beings? That's what we come home to. That's what we then know and walk into this world, so that we're serving the divine moment by moment. That's what it means, that you're dedicating the fruits of your work to God. It means all actions. Work is all karma, all actions, all dedicated. That's a selflessness. That is also a practice for going right at the heart of ego identification. Because the ego wants to say, wait a minute, that's mine. I have to have my share first. And wait a minute, don't forget to save something for me. So right away, we're confronting the limitations of the ego mind and where it gets stuck, even in the preliminary practices for yoga, right? So that's where Patanjali is talking about. And so then when we get into later, when he starts talking about Ashtanga yoga, because Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is talking about Ashtanga, the classic Ashtanga yoga. Ashtanga means the 8 limbs of yoga. And so in Ashtanga yoga, then we're talking about a systematic approach to going through what efforts you would make under the guidance of a teacher to get freer of the mind, purify the mind, clear the body, be able to get into more and more refined states of concentration and focus, and ultimately absorption and samadhi. Even that, there are, the beginning steps that have to do with what are called the yamas and the niyamas. And these are sort of the observances and practices that one does. And they are the foundation of yoga. Often not that much spoken about in the West. We often are thinking, well, you start off with yoga means, are you doing downward facing dog or the cobra pose or something? That's already a later step in the practice of yoga. It rests first on, so this kind of bringing it, that intention, that awareness that you're practicing renunciation, the austerity, you're dedicating the fruits of your labor to the divine. So you're already doing practices, and then when you get to the yamas and the niyamas, then these are various observances. And so when we're looking at yama is abstention from harming others. It's abstaining from falsehood. It's abstaining from theft. It's abstaining from sexual activity and from greed. So those are foundational practices. That again, think of how that confronts a lot of unconscious and consciously driven activity of the ordinary mind. Then these form basically the rules of conduct that really then help quiet the mind. Because if we are agitated by all those different things and we go to sit to meditate, then how are we going to meditate? How are we going to quiet the mind? Because Patanjali starts out with yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. It means that's first sutra is yoga is the stilling of the thought waves of the mind. Because it's in that stillness that our boundless nature stands revealed. It's already there. So if we're agitated by all the desires, all the things going through the mind, then it's very hard to sit for meditation. So the yamas and the niyamas are the foundation for being able to do that. So when Patanjali is talking about that as a foundation for our practices, that is creating the conditions, and that kind of foundation, creating the conditions for enabling us, empowering us to be still and quiet. Part of that is that focus on being able to get free of what's unconsciously and even consciously driving the ordinary mind, getting free of shadow, making it conscious. Not just suppressing, not repressing, becoming conscious and freeing the energy of it so that energy is available for true knowing. That energy is available for the mind to truly serve. If that energy is bound up in ignorance and old patterns, then it's not available for the fullness of who you are and being able to live that fully into this world. So we do these various kinds of practices in order to undo that ignorance. Now, it takes quite a different turn in some ways when we start talking about the spontaneous yoga that unfolds as awakening of Kundalini. And so the power of mantra in this tradition is the power literally of awakened Kundalini. It's Shakti Kundalini in its awakened form, which then has the power to start shifting consciousness and bringing us into that awareness spontaneously. In other words, it's not just self-effort alone. A lot of the foundational practice of yoga was based on self-effort. In many ways, Ashtanga Yoga, also known as Raja Yoga, was seen as a preliminary set of practices done with the aim of finally coming to a point where Kundalini, Shakti, the innate power of consciousness to know the infinite as ourself, is awakened. And now that power is going to continue that process, but now with a spontaneity and an inner power supporting it all. It's not just the poor mind going, oh, I have to get up and meditate at 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, there's a mode of power that helps it wake up, literally wake up, and wake up on many different levels. So the awakening of Kundalini was the esoteric goal of Ashtanga Yoga, of all the yogas, Hatha Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Laya Yoga, Mantra Yoga. They all aimed at awakening Kundalini because it's the root power behind all the yogas. It's the root power that gave even the form of all the yoga practices. While that's moving now, and while we're making use of empowered mantra, like Om Namah Shivaya, that we were chanting last week, we'll chant that again tonight, or Om Kali Ma, these mantras that are a throb of the infinite, of that awakened Shakti that has come down through countless practitioners and still has that extraordinary power to awaken those experiences and begin to bring us beyond the ordinary mind. For one who's not prepared for that, it can be a little disorienting. And most people are going, they say, oh yeah, I want to wake up. But then when you start awakening and there's this whole other dimensions of being beyond the ordinary mind, it can be disorienting. And we have to then deepen our understanding and evolve our practice to embrace that there's a power of grace. Kundalini is the innate power of grace. Power of grace means the power of revelation and transformation. It's the power that undoes what created bondage in the begin with. The mind didn't create bondage, so the mind can't free us of bondage. It can do certain relative things to get us relatively free. Absolute freedom is beyond its capacity. It came in with limitation and bondage. It came in as a projection of the power of the infinite to know what it is to be finite. So it's that power of the infinite that reverses that. That's why Kundalini Shakti, that power, is known as the power of transformation and revelation. It reveals the truth of who we already are. It transforms the mind-body vehicle so that they can act in accordance, in harmony with our highest nature, that we can walk that into this world, that we can bring the boundless qualities of our nature, the boundless love, the boundless compassion, the boundless equanimity, the boundless joy, that we live that into the world. That's what we're called on to do. That's our birthright. That's it. Our inherent nature is that. And so the yogis saw that and say, this is what we want. This is what longing for liberation is. It goes beyond longing for any ephemeral pleasure, and no matter how blissful that might be. Because that resting in the infinitude of pure being, everything pales in comparison. And it gives us access to the power, the strength, to be able to bear the fires of this world and walk the gifts that were given from our own highest nature, that now is infusing the mind and body with more patience than it could ever just produce on its own, more wisdom, more love, more compassion. The mind has limited aspects of those things, but the boundless reservoir, the ocean of that is who you are, that comes from knowing yourself, your true self. For that, we do these practices. So now we're going to be chanting the mantras. We're going to do a slow meditative chant for a few minutes of Om Namah Shivaya, Shivaya Nama Om, and Om Kali Ma, Kali Durga Namo Namaha. So Shiva literally means the auspicious one, the infinite, the Godhead, the witness, the seer who's never seen, the one who's present right here and right now, knows everything about your mind and your body, sees it all as its own self. Shakti, the one who dances as all forms, is Kali, and takes on the forms and knows all forms as her own self, as her own being. She's the divine mother, the great mother, who gives birth to everything. So the mantras are a celebration and an invocation of that as power, as Shakti, as the power of consciousness. They are literally a throb of that knowing, a throb of that awareness. They are a pulsation of that. And it starts out on sort of the gross physical level, a chant out loud. Chanting Om Namah Shivaya and Shivaya Nama Om. Om Kali Ma, Kali Durga Namo Namah. We chant that. Then in meditation, we just start to silently repeat. It might just be Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, or Om Kali Ma, Om Kali Ma. But we're repeating it with the awareness of I am that. I am the mantra, I am the source of the mantra, I am the infinite to which the mantra both refers and is a throb of. I am all of that. So we cultivate that understanding. That's Shaktupaya. Remember we were talking about that last week. Shaktupaya is that mental cultivation of the awareness, I am that, cutting through that root ignorance. All of this in just the simple and delightful practice of chanting and singing and then going into the stillness and letting the mind Continue to take refuge in the mantra by coming back to it. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, or Om Kalima, until even that disappears. And there's just the throb of the awareness of I am. No words, just pure being, spacious, all-embracing, free. Nothing, no one left out. To know that is to know the boundless love that holds all of creation, all creatures in its heart. That's where freedom lies. That's where these practices take us. So now we'll chant. And then after we chant, we'll just sit in the stillness. After we sit for several minutes, I'll ring a gong and we'll chant a few rounds to come out of meditation. But now we'll begin the chant. Shivaya Nama Om Kalima Om Kalima Kali Durga Namo Namah Kali Durga Namo Namah Om Namah Shivaya Om Namah Shivaya Shivaya Namah Shivaya Namah Om Kalima Om Kalima Kali Durga Namo Namah Kali Durga Namo So we end with this prayer, that may all our practices truly benefit everyone, and may all beings know complete freedom from suffering. And namaste. So taking refuge in mantra, it's taking refuge in the throb of the infinite, a pulsation of our own sublime nature. And that's what helps to illuminate the darkness of ignorance, to dispel the contractions, the wrong identification. Keep coming back to mantra, and I am that. I am that infinite one. I am the throb of that infinite one. We're used to going about the day saying, consciously or unconsciously, I'm the mind, I'm the body, I'm the roles I play, I'm the things I'm doing, all that stuff. This is a radical shift in understanding that opens up that space of radical freedom. To know the divine as our own self, to see that everywhere. That's the truth of who we are. That's what we're given to know, and then empowered to walk into the world. So to transform not only our experience, but we transform the world by walking that into the world. The awakening of Shakti, the awakening of grace, the power known in every tradition by one name or another. As we are attuning ourselves to that through the practice, through mantra, then we're walking that into the world. You're a walking presence for that wisdom, a walking presence for that grace. Bring patience and kindness into places where there might just be reactivity and anger. I remember doing meditation programs as a volunteer for some years in federal and state penitentiaries, and going in and seeing the transformative power of these practices, carrying my harmonium in, chanting, and people, guys in the prison looking at me, go, what are you doing? But those who would give themselves the freedom to actually try it, they go, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe that this kind of experience can just come up inside, even here, even within a steel and concrete prison. Any time, any place, that grace, that living presence of the infinite, it's right here, always available. So keep turning your attention to that. You can come back to the mind when it's needed, but let your attention, your awareness rest in the infinite. Let that be the light of consciousness illuminating everyday reality. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Kali Ma. Take refuge in the self. It's the only place to be free. And then walk that freedom into the world. So I want to thank you all for coming this evening and bringing your sublime nature to our gathering this evening. And I want to thank you for the many ways that you support the Anamkara Meditation Foundation by sharing what we offer and making donations that make it possible for us to continue doing that. So with all my heart and with all my love, I thank you for that. And thank you for being you, the embodiment of the divine, practicing the awareness so that you can live that more and more fully into every aspect of your life and spread the grace of wisdom, the grace of knowing, the grace of compassion. Spread it through the world. It's more contagious than a virus. Spread that. So thank you all. Thank you for coming. And I look forward to seeing you next week.